Mr. Biden's projected victory has shone a spotlight on how we handle important foreign policy issues during his presidency. He's entering office at a time when tensions are running high between the U.S. and China. So for more analysis on what Joe Biden's election means for that relationship, let's bring in Jonathan Cheng. He is the China bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. Thanks for joining us. President-elect Biden has previously traveled to China and met with the country's leader, Xi Jinping, multiple times. But over the course of the presidential campaign, Mr. Biden was particularly critical of Xi, called him a thug at one point. How has the president-elect's rhetoric on China changed over time?
Well, it's definitely changed, as you pointed out. I mean, he was counterparts with Xi Jinping as vice president and obviously spent a lot of time together. He boasted about all the time they spent over meals together. But you're right, during the campaign, during the debates, he talked instead of Xi Jinping in a very different manner, talked about him as a thug and said there wasn't a democratic bone in his body, those sorts of comments. So, you know, in a certain way, that's a shift for Biden as a career politician, but it's also a reflection of the general tone and the general shift that you're seeing in Washington on both sides of the aisle.
So Chinese officials didn't congratulate the president-elect right away. Why did they wait, and what was the reaction in China to the outcome of the U.S. election?
Well, you know, there was a lot of debate among pundits and China watchers over here as to which candidate China preferred, and there were good cases to be made for either candidate. But ultimately, I think when the election results first came out, or the beginnings of the results first came out, I think perhaps it really was just wanting to wait until they were certain and they had more of an idea of whether, you know, there was going to be a final call. You know, it was uncertain for a lot of people, and it remains uncertain for, you know, I mean, the election still hasn't been certified yet. So there was that question. But I think ultimately my guess is that there was a sigh of relief to a certain extent here in Beijing. You know, obviously they're not a very transparent government in terms of showing how they feel about this. But just from looking at the smoke signals, I think there's definitely a sense that at least relations aren't going to spiral as quickly as they have in the last year. On the other hand, you know, there is concern as well that not only will Biden perhaps take a more coordinated approach towards China with other allies, but there's also concern over the next 10 weeks and what Donald Trump may do on the way out the door.
Yeah, Donald Trump's relationship with China has been sort of an interesting one in that he would sort of regularly praise Xi Jinping, but then heavily criticize China. And, you know, we've been watching this 4-year trade war between China and the U.S. The two countries are still in an ongoing trade war. What is the expectation about how Mr. Biden will handle that?
Well, it's a tough question, and I don't think, you know, the transition has been very clear about it. It is a bit of a dilemma in a sense. We know that the tariffs and the trade war were popular with large parts of Donald Trump's base, and you know, even if members of the Biden team oppose the tariffs having been put on in the first place in the very premise of the trade war, now that the tariffs are on, you're going to take them off. You're presumably going to want to exact some sort of a price in return. And, you know, Donald Trump spent a lot of his presidency trying to push away some of the other topics in this bilateral relationship so that he could focus on the trade. But I don't know that we're going to see that same approach from a Biden presidency. I think he's going to want to look at human rights and look at, you know, economics more broadly and look at the military relationship and look at all sorts of different things, you know, and not just focus on trade as the be-all, end-all, as we saw for certain parts of the last 4 years.
So the Trump administration slapped sanctions on Chinese officials and companies in light of Beijing's internment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. I think those sanctions are actually quite recent, though, but you would know better than me. Mr. Biden's campaign has referred to Beijing's actions in the region as genocide. Why is that terminology significant, and what would it mean for U.S. China relations if his administration uses that label?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a very, very, very freighted term. Obviously, it conjures up, comparisons to World War II and the Nazis and treatment of Jews. So I think when you have language like that, I think it really amps up, not only the moral element of it, but it also suggests that something needs to be done about it. If it were less than genocide, then not to say that you don't need to do anything about it, but it comes with it a sense that something ought to be done about it. If you're going to label it such, then the question that then follows, of course, is what is to be done about it. So I think, during the campaign, to see Biden come out and say that actually put him ahead of the Trump administration in a sense, because the Trump administration has steered clear of that. They said it's close to genocide or perhaps is genocide, but they haven't gone, all the way and said that. So I think that is going to be a question for the incoming administration. And I don't know that there's a simple answer as to what they're going to do about that. But, as I suggested earlier, I do think that the Biden administration is going to look at dealing with China in all of these different realms, across all of these different portfolios, perhaps more holistically.
Jonathan, I could keep talking to you. We have not talked about Hong Kong. We haven't talked about Huawei, but I have to let you go right now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.